I'm Mike Druckman. I'm a partner with the global law firm Hogan Lovells, and I co-chair the Hogan Lovells Global Cell Tissue and Gene Therapy team, which comprises over 150 lawyers and other professionals, bringing the best of our services to folks in the regenerative medicine space. I'd like to thank Bernie Siegel, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, and the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine for this opportunity to present to this esteemed audience. I'm really fortunate and happy to have three esteemed colleagues from our global team here for this segment of the Hogan Lovells World Compass presentation. We have Benjamin Gohl from Berlin, Germany, Michael Selmella from Paris, and Lowell Zeta from Washington, D.C. Each of them will introduce themselves and then discuss a topic that has impacted all of us, supply chain. They'll share their perspectives on how supply chain issues impact regenerative medicines, which are known in Europe as advanced therapy medicinal products, or ATMPs. And they'll share their thoughts on contracting and other strategies for those in the business of developing, manufacturing, and supplying these life-saving and life-enhancing therapies. So let's start with you, Benjamin. Please say a few words about yourself and your practice. And then please tell us about license requirements and issues in the supply chain from a German and EU perspective, such as which licenses hospitals and pharmaceutical companies need for their activities in relation to the collection of the starting biological materials.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. And hello, everybody. My name is Benjamin Gohl. I'm a senior associate in the Munich office of Hogan Lovells, and my practice focuses exclusively on life sciences clients. And for my clients, I deal with a broad range of matters ranging from regulatory work, clinical trials, early access, for example, over contracting, manufacturing, R&D, license agreements, to lastly, healthcare compliance matters. And yeah, to address your question, Mike, I think I would like to start with and focus on the also starting point of the manufacturer, because as you all know, and in contrast to other products, the manufacturing chain of the product for these ATMPs, regenerative medicines, starts with the cell collection apheresis procedure at the hospital, which means that the hospital becomes part of the manufacturing chain, and therefore under EU laws will always need some type of license. However, it is a matter of local law which particular license requirement applies. Looking at it from a German perspective, there are two different licenses which could apply alternatively, one being, so to say, the normal ordinary manufacturing license, one being a specific license for the collection and procurement of tissue. And under German law, the decisive aspect, as a rule of thumb at least, there are some exceptions, is whether the starting material collected qualifies as blood or blood component, or whether it qualifies as tissue or cells. And interestingly, German law deviates in that regard to some extent from EU laws. Because German law says that stem cells, for example, are a blood component when they are collected from peripheral blood by way of apheresis. In contrast, when the stem cell is collected from bone marrow directly, this would be different, which maybe does not make a lot of sense, and the German legislator has been criticized a lot for that, but this is at least how it states. And what this means is that you really need to look at the starting material that is collected and on how it is collected in order to determine which license is needed under German law for the apheresis procedure conducted by the hospital. In most cases, it will be a manufacturing license, but as said, this needs to be determined taking into account the particulars of the case. And from there, when you go up the manufacturing and supply chain, then of course the manufacture of the product as such, when it is done in the EU, needs manufacturing license under EU laws. Often, however, we see that the product is manufactured in the US, then it will be shipped back to the EU as a finished product, which then requires the pharmaceutical company to hold a manufacturing and import license. There you need to look at which entities and which sites specifically are involved. So what is the physical side of importation? Where's the QP release done? Is it the same or is it another entity? And depending on local laws, you should also consider whether the physical import, so the mere title import, triggers a license requirement or not. The last point in this chain, I would say, is then the sale of the product. Let's assume that the company who has manufactured or imported the product sells it to the local entity before the local entity then sells the product to the hospital. This will require the local entity to hold a wholesale license. So this just is a very quick overview over the license requirements which could apply within this manufacturing and supply chain.
Great. Thank you very much, Benjamin. Important issues for all the companies involved to be aware of. Let's now turn to you, Michael. If you could, from a French perspective, if you tell us a little bit, start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then if you could share some of your thoughts and experiences about supply chain and contracting issues you've seen in France and EU.
Sure, thanks, Mike. So I'm Michael Salmela. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells in Paris, and I've been working for the life sciences industry for now over 20 years. And my focus is on regulatory, healthcare compliance, and transactional matters. And I've been fortunate actually to participate in the launch of several gene therapies in France and more generally in Europe. And so I wanted to share some thoughts on the contracting aspects. And especially how to anticipate the contract workstream when you're launching your gene therapies. Now, a bit similar to what Benjamin was mentioning, you know that gene therapies involve specificities linked to the products that are not common for ordinary medicinal products. And so because of that specificity in the supply, the contracts are obviously impacted. So typical examples are that since the product is obviously more complex, it involves use of genetically modified material, and the supply contracts will include provisions that address the unique manufacturing processes, the storage conditions, transportation requirements, and specialized handling procedures that are associated with these products. Also, the complexity also requires making sure that detailed provisions are included regarding manufacturing standards, quality control, and those regulatory requirements that Benjamin was mentioning. And third, also, gene therapies such as autologous medicine involve personalized treatments tailored to individual patients. And this means that if you're collecting cells and doing the apheresis, for instance, that Benjamin was mentioning, you will have to make sure that you're addressing contractually items such as cell collection, data protection, and again, regulatory requirements. Now, and maybe a last thing is, due to the price of these products, transfer of risk and commercial warranty terms are a very sensitive topics. So what happens in practice is that in our experience, gene therapy companies, they prepare contract templates that address these concerns and manage these risks. But when doing so, we've noted that the contracts are quite sophisticated. And what the typical example is a US biotech company who's launching in a given market or region, for instance, the EU, and seeks to have a one-size-fits-all approach on the contracts, and will push these contracts to the customers, so hospitals. And the issue is that this is not necessarily adapted and can lead to significant delay. One of the reasons is that many of the purchasing entities are public procurement organizations, and they apply their own templates as they want to standardize their own purchasing. And so when they do this standardization work, they expect that suppliers in terms adapt to this approach, and they will refuse contracts that are provided by gene therapy suppliers. But nevertheless, the concern then goes is that the standardized contracts that these procurement organizations are applying are not sufficient and may need to be negotiated in detail, because whereas the company has templates that are actually adapted to the product, these templates used by the purchasing organizations are not adapted to the specificities of the product. And so what happens is that because the timelines of purchasing organizations are not the same as for a private company, you may end up with a lot of delay, because in practice, what we've seen is a supplier of these products coming with the template, sending it to the hospital saying, well, we won't actually look at this contract at all. You have to restart from zero using our own template. And now this creates a lot of stress and anxiousness within the companies, because in parallel, these companies are also negotiating their market access and their pricing for their products, for instance, with the governmental authorities. Another example and cause for delay can be actually the contracting practices and resources in the local markets. For instance, for apheresis, this may need to be separately contracted with dedicated suppliers. Again, in France, for example, many hospitals do not have the capabilities to do apheresis, and they outsource this to a specific entity which deals with this nationwide. And so in practice, for a company, this means that you may end up engaging separate negotiations, on the one hand with the hospital, and on the other hand with this entity dealing with apheresis, and potentially also splitting the contract provisions to the extent the apheresis was included within the supply agreement. So these are two examples which may cause delay. And so if there's one key takeaway to have here, is really to anticipate these potential hurdles and plan appropriate actions when you're preparing market entry with your standard contract. So you need to think about localizing your agreements, because they will be governed by local law. A public hospital, for instance, will not sign foreign law contracts, and private hospitals will be reluctant as well. You'll also have to think about whether there are different purchasing scenarios, whether you are going through public or private tenders, and whether you need to have separate contracts with separate entities. And also, to the extent you are contracting with specific public hospitals, you need to anticipate how you can actually introduce your own template terms within the contract framework that the hospital is imposing. So this is a sort of a quick view on how to anticipate this. And again, this is really crucial, because this can lead to significant delay. And again, delaying your market access, you know, this is an issue because of all the market exclusivity and patent protection, which says that when the product has been negotiated and pricing has been negotiated, then the clock ticks and you need to go fast.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. Some really practical advice and insights from someone who's on the ground trying to make these things actually happen. So very helpful. Before we turn to Lowell, I'll just add that I've seen in the US, there are issues a lot of times with working with hospitals as the supplier, because as healthcare providers, they have their own sort of approaches and healthcare standards as a provider of healthcare, not necessarily as a manufacturing supplier. And it's really important for the manufacturer to impose by contract and to ensure that they understand the additional different requirements as a producer, a manufacturer, essentially, a producer of supply for these pharmaceutical products. So now let's turn, thank you. Let me turn to Lowell Zeta, my partner in DC. If you could, Lowell, also say a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then share your thoughts from a US vantage point on supply issues facing these companies, and perhaps also global issues that companies that are across borders might also be dealing with.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and to all of you. I'm Lowell Zeta. I'm a partner in the FDA Life Sciences regulatory practice in DC, as Mike mentioned. A lot of my work is on the product quality, manufacturing, and compliance space. I'm working with biotech startups through commercial readiness and scale up, and commercialization of marketing with manufacturers in the space. And I've had the opportunity, I've rejoined the firm beginning of 2021 after serving as senior counselor to Commissioner Hahn at the FDA, and worked on various agency-wide priorities, including especially related to COVID-related medical product policies. And so the topic today is one that I worked in really closely at the agency and continue to, as you know, global supply chain issues persist. From a U.S. perspective, you know, I think that there are several compounding factors with the complexity, the novel, you know, nature of these products, and the difficulty in manufacturing and scaling up, just generally. But then also, as many know, some of the challenges, workforce challenges within FDA, within the Biologics Center that's seated to review and address and handle these the submissions and marketing submissions and questions that come in from developers related to cell and gene therapies. Some of those workforce challenges against just the number of new candidates and questions that have come in. So it's been a challenge for what we've seen on the industry side, getting meaningful feedback to help move along your development program. And that includes especially on the CMC side, the manufacturing scale up. So one of the big takeaways more recently is the FDA kind of leaning in, saying, we recommend that you don't implement late stage manufacturing changes. And that's, general rule, but especially I think given the complexities and the factors that I just mentioned, make it even more of a challenge to the extent that issues pop up. So as Michael was mentioning, planning ahead, really critical, and especially in the global context for, studies, programs with and targets that are intended for, a few dozen folks, and they can be globally. It's really important and critical to have your supply chain really mapped out from contracting to supplier qualification, which I can talk about later in a bit on sort of what that entails.
Excellent. Thank you, Lowell. Some really important global perspectives and view from U.S. practice. So let's turn to a couple of key issues. Benjamin, we'll turn back to you. I understand that some treatment centers have been requiring pharmaceutical and biotech companies to make significant payments for increased efforts that they need to provide when prescribing, handling, and administering ATMPs compared with other medicines. Please tell us a little bit about that phenomenon and how you've seen that play out.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that's indeed an interesting issue which we have seen in relation to the contract negotiations which were happening between treatment centers and clients. So in some cases, treatment centers basically said, yeah, well, guys, we will prescribe and use your product, but only if you, so you meaning the pharmaceutical company, reimburse us for certain efforts we are experiencing when using your product. So the rationale of the hospital was that under German law, a hospital for treating a patient in inpatient care with a certain disease will receive a lump sum, regardless of the medicinal product they use. So basically, they always receive the same amount of money, whether they use an ordinary biologic or a small compound, as well as when they use an ATMP. And the ATMP, and there the hospitals to some extent have a point, requires them to use additional efforts because obtaining informed consent, for example, they argued is more complicated because yeah, just the information to the patient is much more complicated because the product is more complicated, or the specific thawing procedure for the product, which is cryopreserved and then needs to be thawed in accordance with the SMPC prior to administration, is of course also more burdensome than just using an ordinary medicinal product. And our client, of course, then had the concern, okay, can we really pay the hospital in order for them to use our product? Because under German law, as under many other laws, there are specific anti-kickback, anti-corruption statutes, basically saying you cannot make an undue payment to a healthcare provider in order for them to use your product. So the question arises, is this an undue payment or not? I mean, easy to answer is that of course you can pay them for their manufacturing service. I mean, this is just fee for service. They provide the cell collection and you pay them for this service. But when it comes to the examples I just mentioned, so for example, yeah, informing patients about the treatment, obtaining consent, preparing the product for administration, then yeah, it gets really complicated because you can argue, in contrast to what the hospital says, that the German reimbursement boards have just decided, okay, this amount is what is justified to for a hospital to receive for this particular treatment, and this covers basically everything which is within the responsibility of the hospital. And when the pharmaceutical company would then make a payment on top of that, there would basically a double payment for the same activity rendered by the hospital. So this is something, where you would really closely look into what exact activities the hospital claims payment for, and when it's something which lies within their core responsibility as the healthcare provider, the line should generally be not to pay them. But of course, it's also a commercial issue when they really block the product. Then you will need to see how you can resolve this somehow in the negotiations.
And that's part of the services that we Hogan Lovells provide, right? Is that we raise these issues, make sure the company's aware about the limitations, and help, where appropriate, push back on the hospitals.
Yeah, right. And just see where you can accommodate the hospital's need in order to make the product and the whole procedure work, and see where you would really need to draw the line also to protect the company against criminal liability.
Excellent.
And maybe for France, I mean, these have faced actually the exact same issue in France. They have the same tendency. Hospitals trying to grab more money, basically, to fund their treatments, and they also are entitled to certain amounts from the government. And you need to be careful, because if you say once yes to one of the hospital, this will contaminate potentially all your other tenders. So this is really an important point to anticipate and coordinate internally.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. Really important insights for companies in the space to know. Michael, let's stay with you. I understand you've observed some situations in which pharmaceutical companies may have entangled themselves in regulatory requirements more than they really need to, and where hospitals really the ones that are legally accountable. Could you fill us in a little bit about that issue?
Yes, so it's linked to some extent with what Ben was mentioning also, is that there is such a heavy regulatory framework, both for the company and the hospital, that sometimes, the hospital will be saying, I'm actually quite aware of my regulatory duties, and they won't give explanations to the company on how exactly they comply and what they're supposed to do. And on the other hand, the company itself wants to make sure that they are sort of end-to-end control on the treatment side, complying 100% with regulatory requirements. And so, to give you an example, the company may require the hospital to provide appropriate information to patients about the gene therapy treatment, including informed consent and potential risks. And while it's important for the patients to receive the accurate and comprehensive information, actually the companies, I've seen them actually involve themselves extensively in reviewing and approving and trying to approve actually the hospital's patient communication material. And the lesser risk is that you might be duplicating efforts, but actually the higher risk is for the company to be involved in that, and potentially requiring the hospital to include certain documentation or information, which then can create internal issues within the hospital and potentially lead to confusion with the patient. And so what we're trying to achieve here often with the clients is that clients are trying to understand what are the local regulatory requirements, and we try to give them a clear explanation on this is the sphere of the company and your regulatory framework on which you are operating, and this is the hospital's framework, and you should be aware of what the hospital is requiring, but you should avoid or limit at least the extent to which you are trying to control and dictate any compliance measures by the hospital, because if you're doing so, you may be stepping too far and exposing yourself to liability.
Excellent. Really important issues to know. Obviously, some really subtle points that need to be understood when entering these really complex agreements to get these medicines to patients who need them. So Lowell, we'll turn back to you. And I want to give you a chance to drill down a little bit more on some of your prior comments, as well as to address some of the role of legislation and FDA policies in preventing shortages, which, you know, is obviously in this area can be a real difficult challenge. In addition, you know, the other issues that will come into play, including for companies developing the products, the investigational products, and trying to do supplies for clinical trials.
Sure. And happy to get started on that and dig in a little bit more. And And then also to touch on what Michael was mentioning with respect to part of the, your supply chain planning and some other tools along the way. But so just to build on what I mentioned in terms of FDA's comments with respect to late stage manufacturing changes, and just wanted to touch on just to kind of laser in on a couple of points. One, just the number of candidates as of April of this year. FDA's now reorg super office OTPs has already more than 2,000 INDs for cell and gene therapy candidates. That's with this plan through PDUFA funding, additional funding to hire more folks, which takes a lot of time. And I think we've started to see a little bit some data of what does that mean for industry, for our developers. And a big takeaway is the shift from pre-IND meetings, that's also in part with COVID, but to written responses and virtual town hall meetings, which are helpful. And we've had a couple, but a little different when it's specific to your product and your product issues. And so really underscores important to engage the right team early, folks that understand the science, but also the sort of regulatory framework and kind of the evolving policies, as you're mentioning, with respect to updated guidances and, for example, at the end of last year with respect to gene therapy platforms and development expectations. And then also with respect to manufacturing changes, what those comparability standards will look like for your studies as you are scaling up, and really how to approach it so that you're not putting at risk, your clinical program that's moving into pivotal studies. So on that, to move now to kind of more broadly, supply chain planning from a kind of a GMP quality perspective. Now there, as I mentioned at the outset, and folks have already mentioned, I mean, the complexity of a global pharmaceutical supply chain and the various components. Ben and Michael mentioned apheresis in the context of, a autologous, for example, CAR T therapy. So leaving a patient in Paris and traveling to multiple manufacturing sites across the globe and then returning back to that patient in such a short time period. It's so important to have these issues ironed out. One, in addition to the contracting component, which is significant, is the kind of broader supplier qualification. FDA has guidance, ICH has guidance on quality risk management principles, but in the context of supply chain resilience, and frankly, I mean, the sensitivities of supply chain interruptions and challenges during the pandemic, really, highlighting some of FDA's more recent policies of additional reporting obligations, risk redundancy plans when required. But so with respect to quality risk management principles, we've been seeing, leading industry adopting, integrating these principles more into their supplier qualification process through robust GMP assessments on the front end as you're identifying potential manufacturers, and then also considering these important other factors, from manufacturing weaknesses to compliance history to vulnerabilities of location and where these sites are in fact or expecting a spike in demand. So various factors that are important to consider when going through the supply chain, supplier qualification process. And then additional point, I know that we're running a bit short on time, is a really good understanding of FDA's approach and policies for supplier quality oversight. As we're moving through the development program and planning for pre-approval inspections, as I mentioned, gap assessments, inspection readiness work is very critical, but then also understanding how FDA carries out the process through some adapted, updated tools specifically remote review information requests in addition to on-site reviews. So planning for all those different tools and components and being able to respond quickly, fully, completely, et cetera. And so those are areas of policies and kind of practical approaches to kind of tie into the contracting piece.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights, Lowell, as well as Benjamin and Michael. Really appreciate your making time today to speak to this audience. Want to welcome everybody in the audience to reach out to any of us individually to follow up. Obviously, there are a lot of many important and subtle questions and issues to anticipate that come only with having been through this a number of times and having been called upon to address some problems that have come up. We'll be very happy to help advise and look forward to the opportunity to work with any of you that could use our assistance, and also really would like to help you forward your mission and bring these life-saving and life-enhancing products and therapies to patients.